Honourable Member for Nanaimo-Cowichan.
Mr. Speaker, I'm rising to speak on Bill C-4, an act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 21st, 2013 and other measures. And it was interesting, Mr. Speaker, to just hear the Conservative House Leader talk about the planned deficit reduction and how they're ahead by $7 billion. And a good question that it would be welcome at some point for the government to answer is exactly how much of that deficit reduction was as a result of money that did not flow to approve programs and services, because we've certainly heard from communities that money that they expected to see or proposals that they had submitted had not been funded despite the government announcements. So that would be a good thing for this House to know. Mr. Speaker, this bill is the second act to implement Budget 2013. And it is another budget implementation bill that is about 300 pages. And this particular piece of legislation amends or repeals 70 pieces of legislation. Some of the things that it tackles is it strips health and safety officers of their powers and puts nearly all of these powers in the hands of the minister. It significantly weakens the ability of employees to refuse to work in unsafe conditions. It moves to eliminate binding arbitration as a method to resolve disputes in the public service, and it guts Canada's most venerable scientific research institution, the National Research Council. You know, I want to thank our House Leader, the member from Skeena-Bulkley Valley, for raising the fact that once again we've seen this government limit debate. And this is the fourth attempt by the Conservatives to evade scrutiny by parliamentarians and the public. And in the past, we had Bill C-38, Bill C-45, and Bill C-60. And Canadians deserve an opportunity to hear a detailed, thorough, in-depth study of such wide-ranging pieces of legislation. And of course, we've got the limiting of the ability of this House to scrutinize this legislation. And why should we care about that? What we've seen in the past is that they brought forward legislation that had errors in it. And because of the complexity of the legislation and the length of time that we were able to have some oversight with it, they've actually had to bring forward subsequent legislation to correct that. And in fact, what we see here is this piece of legislation has to fix something that happened with a technical mistake in Bill C-60, which would have doubled the taxation level of credit unions and casse populaires. In September, tax experts discovered that the changes made in Bill C-60 would result in Quebec taxpayers being overburdened on dividends compared to taxpayers in other provinces. Now, Mr. Speaker, because I only have 10 minutes, I'm going to focus on three particular aspects of this legislation. One is the fact that this legislation will reduce the number of permanent members on the Veterans Review and Appeal Board. Number two, it's fixing the mistakes on the credit union tax hikes. And number three, it pushes ahead the Conservative plan on the $350 million tax hike on Labour-sponsored venture capital funds. Now, when it comes to veterans, Mr. Speaker, what this Bill C-4 does, it reduces the number of permanent members on the Veterans Review and Appeal Board from 28 to 25. And the disappointing piece about this is this was an opportunity for the Conservatives to actually bring forward separate legislation that looked to improve the Conservative record on veterans affairs. What we know is that, of course, we haven't always, the NDP hasn't always been happy with the Veterans Review and Appeal Board, but just simply changing numbers will not improve the situation. In my own riding of Nanaimo-Cowichan, the Veterans Office has now closed, and veterans are now forced to go further afield in order to get the services that they require. So just so Canadians understand a little bit about the Veterans Review Board, of the 76,446 Canadian Forces clients of Veterans Canada, 1,400 are totally and permanently disabled. 406 of them will not receive a pension or allowance from the Canadian Forces. The plan proposed by the Ombudsman is based on an actuarial analysis to accurately determine for the first time how current benefits neglect certain veterans and will continue to neglect them unless changes are made quickly. And Mr. Speaker, the Veterans Ombudsman, Guy Perron, said that more than 400 of the most severely disabled veterans in Canada are not eligible for the Canadian Forces pension plan, while hundreds of other permanently disabled veterans could suffer the same fate and risk spending their retirement years at a lower standard of living than they had before the age of 65 due to sufficient income. And Mr. Speaker, I certainly, in my riding of Nanaimo-Cowichan, we hear regularly from veterans and their families about their difficulties in accessing services, about the fact that they can't get access to some services that they expected, and the fact that the money that's available simply does not respect and honor the service to our country that many veterans made. And of course, I've spoken in this House previously about my father being a long-serving member of the Canadian Armed Forces, and I'm proud to say that I grew up on Army bases from coast to coast in this country. I do have a letter from a member of, a former member of the RCMP, that talks about the assault on health care benefits for members of the armed forces and the RCMP. And I just want to read a brief note from that, because I think this is part of what the Veterans Appeal Board hears about the discrepancy in funding and the difficulties in funding and whether a member is entitled to funding. And this member said that they had written expressing their concern and profound disappointment with the fact that the government has arbitrarily decided to claw back so many necessary treatments after we risk our health and indeed our lives. I was assured that my health and welfare of my family will be looked after. That sacred trust has been unabashedly broken. While that in and of itself is repugnant, my greater fear is that once the members begin to see that their efforts in ensuring the safety of Canadians may actually result in huge costs to them, they will necessarily become more hesitant to engage in actions that risk their health and well-being. This policy is short-sighted, unfair, and contrary to Canadian values. And, Mr. Speaker, whether we ask members of the armed forces or whether we ask members of the RCMP to risk life and limb, we need to respect that when they come back to Canada or when they retire from the forces, that they are treated in a fair and respectful manner. And it would be incumbent upon this government to actually work with veterans and their families to ensure that the services that are provided are adequate. The second piece that I want to touch on, Mr. Speaker, is fixing the mistake on the credit union's tax hike. This bill introduces changes to fix a legislative error that the Conservatives made by rushing the last omnibus budget bill through. Their mistake hiked taxes on credit unions to 28% instead of the intended 15%. I want to read from the Credit Union Central of Manitoba's remarks to the House of Commons Standing Committee back on C-60. And the reason I want to quote from that previous presentation is because it highlights the importance of credit unions in our communities. And of course, in my riding of Nanaimo-Cowichan, we have a couple of different credit unions, and they're very important in all of our communities, but in particular in some of our smaller communities. So the Credit Union Central of Manitoba said that many credit union branches are in communities that other financial institutions vacated because they were not deemed profitable enough. Our business model, paired with a fair tax policy like the additional deduction, has made it both possible and attractive for credit unions to grow in places where our competitors have retreated. They go on to say that the removal in Bill C-60 of the additional deduction for credit unions will simply compound the impact of regulatory demands by requiring credit unions to pay a higher portion of their net income in federal tax and further reduce their ability to build capital, invest in new technology, and stay competitive. Now, Mr. Speaker, this was a brief that was presented when Bill C-60 was in the House for a reading, and because we had limited time to debate that, there wasn't enough attention paid to that particular presentation and other presentations around the impact of Bill C-60. And so, of course, now we're amending that mistake. They conclude their presentation by saying, I would argue that this tax deduction has proven to be good public policy. If it were to remain in place, it would continue to be good public policy because it will help credit unions provide effective competition in the financial services sector and assist with the government's stated desire to increase competition in this sector. It would also represent good public policy by helping maintain strong financial services in as many communities as possible and contribute to the sustainability of the many communities in rural Canada where credit unions are the only financial institution. Mr. Speaker, I can see that you're signaling that I've only got 1 minute left. So on the venture capital program, I just want to conclude by saying that this has been a very successful program in British Columbia. There was an evaluation of the venture capital program, and it indicated that not only did it contribute to job creation, but it also contributed to the fact that it helped grow companies who then went on to expand and become more successful companies. So, removing the supports for that program is unfortunate, particularly when the government continues to talk about the importance of job creation and supporting small business. So we would like to see the government reverse its decision on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.